Hello everyone, and thanks for tuning in to the second webinar in our series titled Internal Carbon Pricing, Practical Experiences from the Private Sector. The webinar will begin after this brief announcement. Before we get started, we have two housekeeping items to announce. One is on the software's question and answer functionality, and the second is a note from our lawyers. First, this webinar series is designed to be an open, interactive conversation, and participants are invited to submit their questions via the Q&A function in the menu bar at the top of your screen at any point during the event. Due to time constraints, we will not be able to address every question submitted today, but will answer as many as possible. Note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available online. Second, we are required to draw your attention to the following statement, which is being displayed on your screen currently, and I will read now. Throughout this webinar series, participants shall comply with competition law requirements and shall not enter into any discussion, activity, or conduct that may infringe any applicable competition law. By way of example, participants shall not discuss, communicate, or exchange any commercially sensitive information, including non-public information relating to prices, marketing and advertising strategy, costs and revenues, strategy in relation to decisions on internal project screening values, trading terms and conditions with third parties, including purchasing strategy, terms of supply, trade or distribution strategy. This applies not only to discussions during formal meetings, but also to informal discussions before, during, and after meetings. Should the meeting discuss matters that contravene competition law requirements, it is the responsibility of participants to notify the moderator, who will discontinue the discussion or close the meeting. Many thanks for your attention. Now we are pleased to welcome and hand it over to Tom Kerr from the International Finance Corporation and the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition.
Thank you, and welcome to our audience from around the world. I believe we have over 200 participants that have dialed in to join us for this webinar today. It's the second in a series of webinars we've been hosting together with Yale University, the World Economic Forum, and the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, which I head in my role at the International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank Group. We're very excited to be live here from Yale University and to hear from some experts, both at the leadership level and the implementation level, that have been key to this path-breaking new carbon charge program that Yale uses to measure and manage its carbon emissions. Before I invite our panelists to speak, I'd like to just set the scene a bit. So first, I'd like to just comment on the fact that we're riding a very positive wave on climate change lately. You will see on Friday of this week, we will see the Paris Agreement come into force, entering into force after 55 nations representing 50% of greenhouse gas emissions have ratified. A very fast success for the Paris Agreement. Secondly, last month we saw the International Civil Aviation Organization, comprised of airline companies and countries, agree to limit their emissions starting in 2020, including through carbon trading. And third, we saw the Montreal Protocol amendment come into place last month as well, which will phase out HFCs, which are a highly potent greenhouse gas. So we're riding a wave and we're doing very well. I think, but we're not there yet. In terms of, if you add up all of the country plans that were submitted to Paris in the Paris Agreement, it's tremendous leadership, and we see trillions of dollars of investment potential if these are implemented. But all those together will not get us to below 2 degrees pathway, which is where we need to be if we are to stabilize climate change. A key tool to try to raise ambition and to achieve success, both from the business and from countries, is carbon pricing. Carbon pricing has been a win-win. It reduces emissions. It generates revenues that can be used for climate finance and to shift investments, as well as it has other benefits, very important benefits, like reducing local air pollution, congestion, traffic, and generating more energy efficiency. That's why we're seeing a real groundswell of interest in carbon pricing as a policy, both at the business level but also with governments. Today we have over 60 jurisdictions globally pricing carbon in some way, and many more countries are planning to do this as part of their Paris commitments. On the business side, CDP reports that over 1,200 companies globally either currently price carbon internally or plan to do so in the next year or two. This is a huge shift from a few years ago when I believe there was only 150 or so companies doing this. Carbon pricing and companies come in many shapes or sizes. There's a lot of questions about how to put in place a price on carbon. What price level should I choose? How do I influence my decisions internally as a company? So that's what this webinar is here to design, to answer these tough questions that are being faced by many companies around the world. So I'm really pleased to have a true leader in Yale University. They've been working for a couple years now on this carbon charge program. They've been, I think, uniquely amongst a lot of the partners that are doing internal carbon pricing. Yale has been interested in documenting and sharing its experience globally. And this is really filling a knowledge gap that we have in this area. So what I'd like to do now is today in the discussion, we'll have two speakers talking maybe at the leadership level about why a carbon charge. What was the motivation for applying this carbon charge, and how is it working? How is it going forward? And then the second set of speakers will talk in the implementation, in the weeds, trying to figure out how has Yale, what challenges has it faced, what successes has it seen, and what's next for the program. So for now, I'd like to introduce next Ben Pollack, who is the provost and the William C. Brainerd Professor of Economics at Yale University. He's going to be our first speaker to talk a little bit about some of the how and the why for the Yale carbon charge.
So thank you, Tom, and welcome everybody to Yale. And we're sitting in Yale SOM, the School of Management, so welcome here. I'd like to talk about three things. Why a carbon charge, just refresh us of what the society is trying to do there. Why at Yale, what are we trying to do at Yale? And then just some high-level lessons of what we've learned so far, and I'll leave the detailed lessons to people who know more about the details. So why a carbon charge? Why taxes on carbon? This is a public policy issue, and the fundamental reason we believe in it here at Yale is the idea of getting prices right. And I want to emphasize that we're looking at this in the pure sense of getting prices right. We're not thinking this as a backdoor way to fund other things, even good things like sustainability efforts. We're just treating this as a pure exercise in getting incentives right. What does that mean? Why do you need carbon charges for that? If you don't have carbon charges, then the price of, say, energy, that's our main issue around here, the price of energy reflects the cost of producing gas and transporting gas to the campus and around the campus, but it doesn't reflect the cost that burning that gas has on the environment. So it doesn't reflect the full social cost of using gas and causing pollution and climate change. So we want to have an additional charge when we're thinking about the price of energy, whenever we're using it around campus, to try and get the incentives right, to try and make sure that people who are making trade-offs reflect in their trade-offs the effect that they're having on the environment. And that's not just for Yale, that's the experiment that the world is engaged in as we consider carbon charges. So just 2 points of that were important for us, I think. One, two things that tend to get forgotten in the carbon charge thing, and in the whole carbon charge literature and implementation. The first is that we are going to use the same price, we want to use the same charge on carbon when we're thinking about burning energy and making the world worse, right? When we're thinking about, we want to have the same price giving us a disincentive to burn carbon and cause carbon emissions, as we do, the same price as we do when we're thinking about investments that reduce carbon emissions. So we want to use the same accounting, the same incentives when we're thinking about something that's going to adding a new building that's going to increase our carbon emissions, and when we're thinking about putting in solar panels or things that will reduce carbon emissions. We want it to be kept very simple. The second thing I think is perhaps even less well understood as we've gone through this, and that is that in some sense, the focus when you try and talk about this, at least in our community, tends to be on small actions rather than big actions. And while small actions are important, let me give an example of a small action, remembering to close the window, remembering to turn the thermostat down, remembering to turn the lights off at the end of the day. Those things are important. I don't want to belittle those at all. Those are relatively small compared to the big actions. The big actions are things like building buildings and putting in solar panels. And the reason those are big and important is that those things last forever, not just daily events. Those things, once you put the carbon charge on those, that carbon charge is acting like an annuity that last essentially forever. So you really care about the incentives for big actions. Right? So that's why do a carbon charge at all? Why Yale? Why are we involved in this? So we're a research and teaching institution. We're a university. And so this for us is an experiment. And it's an experiment that we want to make as public as possible. And what's the main experiment here? The main experiment is, can we do this? Can we get this implemented in our relatively complicated organization? And what can we learn from trying to get it implemented? Now that's an important lesson for us because it means that even if we fail, we succeed in some sense. So suppose we try and get this done and it's just hopelessly complicated and we actually fail to get people to buy into the idea and to accept the idea of a carbon charge. That's still good in our role, in our mission as a research and teaching institution, because the lessons we learn from our, in that case, failed attempts are going to be useful for the rest of the world. Now, having said that, of course, I don't want to fail. I don't like failing. I like succeeding. I have every intention of succeeding. But for us, the main thing is generating lessons that others can use. And of course, eventually, we want to see how effective those carbon charges are. So the second experiment is, what effect do they in fact have on our consumption of carbon, on our emissions of carbon? So what are our lessons so far? Well, I guess we're a year and a bit into this. I think there's some lessons that we kind of knew were going to come, and some lessons which are surprises for us. I would say the lesson we knew was coming, but it's proved every bit as complicated as we thought it would, is there are many units in a university and many units in a multi-divisional firm or a complicated government organization that don't really have budgets, let alone energy budgets. So in the education speak world, they're not RCM. Most places are not budgeted on responsibility center management. And where units don't really have budgets, they don't see the price of carbon, the price of energy at all, even now, let alone the price of carbon plus the carbon charge. So one of the first things we have to solve, and are working to solve, is making the price of consuming energy more visible to people who actually make the decisions on how much energy we consume, both on the day-to-day basis, the thermostat and window basis, and long-term when we're thinking about facilities projects, putting in solar panels, building or not building a building, and so on. That was a lesson we knew we were going to have, but it turns out to be every bit as tough as we thought it was going to be. I would say the second lesson is a surprise. We want to run our carbon charge to be revenue neutral. And there are two reasons for this. The most important one is we believe that out there in a country like the US, revenue neutrality is probably the key to getting buy-in from various stakeholders and getting this accepted politically. So that's the right experiment for us to run if we're trying to do an experiment for society. And it's also true internally. We have units at Yale that are very high carbon users, IT, the medical school, our physics department, and we want to get buy-in from them, so we need things to be revenue neutral so that your initial carbon consumption, you're not penalized or rewarded for your initial carbon consumption. All right, we knew that going in. What was a surprise is how hard it is to explain revenue neutrality. I thought as a naive economist, this was an easy idea. I think it's turned out to be extremely complicated. People have a tendency to think revenue neutrality means revenue neutrality for every single unit, and that doesn't work. Of course, if it's revenue neutral for every single unit, there's no incentive at all. If you're just handing the money in and getting it back again, then you don't have any incentive to cut down your carbon emissions. So that's a basic lesson, but more complicated than that, as we tried to explain revenue neutrality, we found people would interpret it, they would interpret the resulting carbon charge scheme as kind of a contest among them. And that wasn't very healthy. It turns out that once the units started viewing things as a contest among them, they started saying things like, this is going to reduce our degree of cooperation. So we've had to find different language to explain it and to get it through, even at the mundane level of working this into the budget. Some of the resistance from the budget officers has been revenue neutrality is complicated to implement. Now, I'll give you a plus. That was a surprise negative lesson. Here's a surprise positive lesson. One of the biggest worries people have about carbon charges at a place like Yale, particularly small units, is how the weather is going to affect their charges. They really worry about that a lot because the weather, this is New England, and the weather can be pretty dramatic in the winter and sometimes not so dramatic. And they're worried that that variation, that volatility is going to blow their budgets apart. Now, revenue neutrality, this was not intended, I didn't anticipate this going into it, although I'm sure people who are more informed did. Revenue neutrality, having your carbon tax essentially geared to the whole university's carbon use, essentially wipes out the weather issues. It wipes out the volatility. Because if there's a bad winter, everyone's carbon use goes up, but because everyone's going up at the same time, you're not charged for that. So that insurance effect has helped us, especially politically. It's helped us immensely get things accepted. I would say another lesson we've learned, before we get into details, is there's a tendency for those of us who are trying to devise a carbon charge to be captured a little bit by good people. This isn't captured by bad people. Good people who care about sustainability. What do I mean by that? I mean that because we tend to think of carbon charges as a way of reducing greenhouse gases for the world, the sustainability, people who are most invested in sustainability and most care about sustainability want to see our carbon reduction go down, and so they keep on wanting to find ways to twist around our carbon charge, basically to lead to higher investment in things like triple glazing and so on. Now, I'm not against investing in triple glazing or intelligent thermometers, thermostats and lighting systems. I'm all in favor of that. But the point of the carbon charge, as I said at the start, is to have one price whether you're using carbon or whether you're saving carbon. So you need to keep your sustainability investments a little separate from your carbon charge. Mm-hmm. It's fine. In our case, it's revenue neutral, so it actually genuinely is not generating revenue for good stuff like sustainability investments. But actually, for the thing to be working correctly, you need to think of these, in my view, in two separate buckets. Investing in sustainability is a good thing to do, and the carbon charge helps you assess when it's a good thing to do. But when you get them conflated, it tends to actually muck up the message and make it harder to do. So I'd say those are the three big lessons we've had. There's a lot of small lessons. People keep on forgetting what we're trying to do here. You have to keep on reinforcing the basics. And it's infinitely complicated once you get into the depths of the organization, but I'll let others like Tim speak to that. So I'll stop and let Tim take over.
Thanks, Ben. That's great. I think you've teed up a lot of really good background and then some early lessons. That's really useful. As we turn over to Tim, I wanted just to remind the audience to be sending your questions in, because after Tim, we're going to do a little round of Q&A around this topic. So Tim Pavlis, you are the Assistant Vice President for Strategic Analysis and Institutional Research. Would love to hear your perspective on the carbon charge.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Thanks, Ben. So I have the honor of working with Ben and others in the provost office here at Yale, and one of my responsibilities was to be the provost representative as we worked on this last year of the carbon charge pilot. So what I just wanted to share in these next few minutes was a little bit of the organizational lessons that we had before we get into much more of the details with Jen and Ryan. The carbon charge at Yale, emanated about 2 years ago through a committee chaired by Bill Nordhaus that was comprised of faculty, staff, and students that was, looking at the question of whether a carbon charge would be something that Yale should experiment with. And then in the academic year that just ended, we did our first phase of that pilot and had Jen Milikowski and Ryan Lamel, who you'll hear from shortly, to lead that part of the experiment. We also formed a committee that represented many of the administrative functions that would need to interact in order to oversee the carbon charge. And I think one of the, I think this is probably relevant for folks on the line, that, that committee had a very broad mandate of how they should interpret this motivation to have a carbon charge at Yale. And, one of, I think, the lessons organizationally is that you need to make sure that you have very clear objectives, and you need to make sure that the bounds of the experiment and how widely you want to experiment are actually well defined, so that you can stay on track, which through what can become quite a thicket of things to experiment with. So I think that for me was the biggest lesson about experimentation. As Ben said, here at Yale, this is all about experimentation, and I think the lesson for me is we initially thought we needed to test the really big things. We needed to test the question of, do we need to have a revenue neutral charge versus do we want something that's not revenue neutral? We needed to worry about some of the big budget dynamics, like the units within the university that bear their own energy charges today versus those that do not? How do we deal with those questions? But the reality is, and I think the lesson that we're now carrying forward into the subsequent implementation of the charge, is that there's actually a lot of micro issues that you need to experiment with, and I wouldn't underestimate the importance of those things. Like, what's the language that we use to describe revenue neutrality, right? As Ben said, a lot of people got confused, and so what we're grappling with is in both the mechanics as well as literally the language that we use to describe concepts like that. How can we most effectively implement this? What does the actual energy statement that we send to building occupants look like? Where is there text on there? We're A/B testing things like Amazon of what would make a more effective bill. Who do we actually send those bills to? And how do we get them engaged with various people in their communities? And so I would encourage you to not get too caught up on feeling like you need to experiment across a really broad field. I think there's some relatively big choices that you can make early on, and then invest experimentation time in some more of these things that may feel like micro issues. The second organizational lesson is that you really do need to simplify to focus on the tax itself. As Ben mentioned, our test is whether and how this can be implemented. That's our first test. And when you go out into a community like Yale and start talking to people about the carbon charge, you hear and learn a lot about a much broader set of sustainability initiatives and sustainability desires and the organizational capabilities that we need to have in place to assist people in reducing their carbon footprint. I would encourage you to stay more laser focused on a charge as a specific single piece of policy, but not the extent of your entire sustainability portfolio, so that you can wrestle with all those details that might feel like weeds, but that are actually really critical to having a successful charge. And let me just end with some of the positives that I've seen and that I'm excited about as we take this into the next phase of implementation. First, here, this has really brought our community together in, I think, a very interesting way. It's bridged academic and operational. It's bridged faculty, staff, and students in a way that I think can be very productive, and I imagine could be replicated elsewhere in other organizations. And it created a lot more interest in energy reduction, even to the extent that's not tied directly to the charge. So people have been more aware and engaged. Hearing people talk about things like tons of CO2 regularly is, I think, quite a fascinating thing. Talking to folks in the budget office about not just how much does energy cost, but what are the emissions and how might we go about reducing those, is, I think, a very positive step, and one that I'm excited to continue as we continue this experimentation in future years. So I'll turn it back to Tom.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tim. I think that it's really key, the communications aspects both of you brought out, and how do you explain it both to the, if you will, the affected entities, which are the building owners and the operators and the users of energy, as well as to the external public. One question that I want to start with in this round is, a lot of the companies we deal with, the first question they have is sort of, what was that sales pitch to make this decision? What was the argument that really was the key? Was it, this is going to mitigate our climate risks because the climate is impacting our operations? Is it, it's going to reduce energy costs? Is it, we want to be a leader? What was that argument that sort of made you decide to finally do this, and how did you articulate that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, first I should be honest, I don't think we have 100% buy-in. I think there's going to be still some people who don't agree with this. That's good for the experiment too, because surely in any society we're not going to expect consensus around this. I think it's the third of those, in terms of the three you put down. Yale, I think, rightly views itself as a leader, wants to be a leader, and particularly a leader in an area where we're learning. So being out there and possibly failing, but learning from our mistakes, that's exactly what a university like ours should be trying to do. And I think if there's consensus about one thing, it's that even people who are very skeptical of this experiment, and well, we don't have many of these on campus, but even those who are very skeptical, even of even the climate deniers, we don't have many of those on campus. They at least want to see Yale as a place where we seek to learn things and make those things available. Let's just say that one additional advantage we have is we aren't a company. We're not in competition around most of what we do. We're not really subject to most of the competition law, so we can be very open about what we're doing, and we can be open about our failures and open about what we do in a way that some companies might be reluctant to be, and that's what we're doing today. Insofar as we learn things, we want as many people as possible to learn from those, and insofar as we make mistakes, we want as many people to avoid those mistakes. Yep. That's a thing that really a university is in a unique position to do.
That's great. No, I appreciate that. I think that's really important in this area. And I'm sure that other universities, I know of others that are asking questions because they've asked me, well, what is Yale doing? So I think you're already having an impact there. We had one question coming in, I think in the same spirit of sort of sharing the lessons learned. As I mentioned, we have 60+ jurisdictions, governments that are pricing carbon, or many more plan to do it. A common question is, I guess, would be, how can the governments and public policy leaders learn from Yale's experience? Have you thought about how to, you're in maybe a private setting for them, but is there any lessons you could maybe share with them?
So I'll let Tim comment as well, but I would say there are, as it were, buy-in questions and there are implementation questions. So any public policy leader, so in state government, for example, in the US or provincial government in Canada, is going to face the problem of how to get a coalition around this. And so it's essentially the question you just asked. And there, I think the experiment we're running around revenue neutrality is a key experiment. I think everybody I know anyway went into this thinking that revenue neutrality was going to make it easier politically. And again, just to say why, it's because you can base your initial weights on the rebates you get of this tax revenue. You can base those initial weights on past usage, and therefore prevent this idea that people who are just initially heavy carbon users are automatically going to be opposed to things. So I think that lesson is true, by the way. I think it's true that revenue neutrality does help you at Yale with the science areas, which are very, very energy intensive, and socially helps you with your heavy industry, who otherwise would see this as penalizing them. But it's turned out, and I think it's an important lesson, that revenue neutrality is a little bit of a double-edged sword. If it's too hard to explain, if you can't get the language right, you don't persuade the people who are skeptical, who tend to be the people who are using a lot of carbon, and you end up just confusing everybody else. So getting that right, I think, is going to be one of our main contributions. The other part will be on implementation, but I'll let Tim comment to that.
No, and I'll just also pick up on the buy-in question. I think on neutrality, one of the things that we consciously chose not to do was to try to redistribute the revenue in the service of some other policy goal. So we've been experimenting with neutrality schemes that, as Ben mentioned, are based on past emissions, rather than saying financial aid is a good thing. We could all agree on financial aid. Let's take the proceeds from this tax and redistribute those through financial aid, or pick your other, your other goal. We haven't tried to link this to other sort of value-laden questions of what the university should do. And I think, I think at the government level, there's often a temptation to try to use the return of the revenue to advance some other policy agenda. We have not tried to do that. And I think that, despite all the challenges of getting people to understand neutrality, that at least allowed us to not add another layer of debate about where we were putting the revenue. The other thing that we're still frankly learning about on implementation is just how many layers of actors there are here, right? I mean, I was constantly talking to Jen and Ryan about who are these decision makers who we're seeking to influence, what kind of decisions, and how do we make sure that they're understanding how to link back the kind of actions that they're taking to what's happening. So here at Yale, we have, most of our schools have deans. They have an administrative staff who are responsible for making sure that the finances add up, but they have all these program goals. And you can talk to the administrative people about the dollars and cents, right? And they might understand those on one level, but you have to also engage other people. And I think the most effective examples we had in the first year of implementation were places where people bridged that gap and had, say, students in a residential college engaged, or a dean in one of the schools who was actually thinking hard about the carbon impact of a programmatic decision. But it's not really that easy to get people to connect all those dots necessarily. It's not as intuitive as the economist might think it is.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think that actually runs out of our time for this segment. I think just to comment on the revenue neutrality and to put a plug in for one of our Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, we just did an executive briefing that summarizes the use of carbon pricing revenues. Has some of the same principles you're talking about revenue neutrality, about keeping the revenues for your carbon discussions and not maybe lending them for other purposes. That's something that we do get a lot of questions about from the governments, and finance ministers are meeting, asking a lot more questions about about carbon taxes, which is a great development, I think. But we also, learning from what you've done will be, I think, very valuable to them as they tread that path. So thank you both for coming today. I think we're now going to switch a bit to the how and the implementation, but it was my pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Tom.
Well, thank you. So now we're going to switch to the question of, as I said, the how. I think we get a lot of questions, and folks want to know what price level do you choose? What is the right price? Then how do you influence decision making internally? How do you make the case to different business units that this makes sense? Even down to what sort of spreadsheets are you using and that sort of thing. And so we're lucky enough today to have with us Ryan Lomel and Jennifer Milhowski, who have been heavily involved with this carbon charge program. I had the pleasure to be with them in Mumbai earlier this year. We had a Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition meeting there at Mahindra Group's offices, and I think all of us were pleasantly surprised by the strong level of interest with Indian corporates. I think that's just the tip of the iceberg. I think we have plenty of, maybe some of them are on the line with us today. We know in Brazil, Mexico, many other parts of the world, we're getting that same interest. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you, Jen, and from Ryan. I'll turn it over to you now to explain a little bit more of the how.
Great, thanks, Tom. We want to echo our provost's comments about experimentation. It is a really core part of what we're doing here at Yale University. We are trying to test this idea of sound government policy on campus. I do want to make one point for the business community that's tuning into this webinar. Revenue neutrality is certainly an important component for our program here at Yale. I think you'll find, based on some of the lessons that we've learned, that it may not be the right fit for your organization, and we'll talk a little bit today about how you can align this policy mechanism with your organization's priorities. Yale's very much like a company. We spend $65 million every year on energy. We have about 14,000 square feet of building space on our campus. We have diverse students, faculty, and staff working on all types of programs, from medical research to historical research and teaching. And what we are really focusing on here is how we complement those diverse energy needs with the policy design questions we have around carbon pricing. So on this slide, you'll see some of the reasons why we are testing carbon pricing. You heard a lot about revenue neutrality and experimenting with market-based solutions to climate change. Another key part for us is really preparing for a high carbon cost future. We're already part of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, a cap and trade system here in the Northeast. So we're paying that cost on our purchased electricity. We expect that cost to go up over time, and the carbon charge here at Yale is just another tool that we have at our disposal to help us start to de-risk and plan for that higher carbon price future. We're also really interested in supporting academics, and by integrating our academics with our operations, as you can see from our provost and economists sitting in on this panel, we can ideally strengthen the policy we have here on campus and export those lessons out to the wider world. I'm going to turn it over to Jen, who's going to talk a bit about our design for this experiment we ran.
Thanks, Ryan, and thanks, Tom. Happy to be with everyone today. So really briefly, I'm just going to touch on an overview before I dive into what we did over this past year. It's a bit, backwards to talk about sort of this process that we went through 12 months ago after hearing from Tim and Ben, who already touched on some of our lessons learned. So I want to put this in context for everyone. We started off really struggling with the scope of what we were doing, as Tim implied. We were not only trying to decide sort of the government type policy that we were going to implement internally, but then we were also trying to look at it from our units, our citizens, you might say, side as well, and make sure that the policy we were implementing was appropriately incentivizing. And so that's challenging. In a lot of ways, if we had a government policy that had a carbon tax and we could simply focus on how we at Yale University were going to respond to that tax and implement our budget appropriately in response, that would be a lot simpler. But we were trying to play both sides of the coin, so that definitely complicated things. And so we did get a bit caught up in the breadth of what we were trying to do. I also think that, it's Tim's point about revenue neutrality and how governments could be redistributive with revenue neutrality to advance another policy goal is important to keep in mind. We were trying to avoid that. And so you'll see that influences what we tested over this past year. So the really quick overview of how we went about designing our experiment. We have approximately 300 buildings that make up our campus here at Yale in New Haven and some outside towns as well. We separated all of those buildings into quintiles based on carbon emissions. And so we ended up grouping the most carbon intensive buildings together so that we could select a sample of those as well as the least carbon intensive buildings. We wanted to make sure that we were really understanding how this would impact the university as a whole. We then went through those quintiles and we made sure we had a diverse array in selecting buildings of different budget category types. As Tim and Ben hinted at, we have very different types of budget designs across our campus. We also have very different building uses. We have public museums as well as molecular biology labs. Those are very different buildings that we needed to make sure we were understanding and getting a representation of. We also wanted to make sure we had really high quality metering on these buildings at the building level so that we could understand the impact and actually collect the data necessary. We then selected one building from each of these quintiles to be represented in one of our 4 treatment groups. So we ended up with 20 buildings in the treatment, and we'll touch on more of those. And then we evaluated those treatment groups, and then we used the rest of the buildings as our control.
And I would just add that we're using the federal government's estimate of the social cost of carbon, about $40 per ton. Our boundary is roughly scopes 1 and 2 emissions from building energy use. And finally, we were allocating this charge on a true-up methodology, so this was not part of our building's budgets or their profit and loss statements during this program. We were sending them informational reports that were keeping them up to date on their carbon usage as well as their carbon cost, and then we settled up at the end. And as you'll see moving forward, we're trying to get this into our profit and loss statements.
Great. So our first treatment group was a redistributive charge. And essentially, this is a revenue neutral charge where the units in the treatment were compared to the average performance of those buildings. So each individual building had a change in their emissions over the course of the year, as did the buildings as a collective, and so they were compared to that collective change. So the pros of this scheme is that it's revenue neutral because it's all comparative to how the group performed as a whole. It's a market-based type of scheme. And the incentive was on the margin. So because it was all compared to the percent change year compared to this baseline that Ryan discussed, an individual unit would not bear an inexorbitant amount of cost in any given year, which we saw as a benefit for a lot of these units that have relatively small budgets. However, there are some cons to a scheme like this where there's a small incentive in the aggregate. You actually end up, if you divide the $40 social cost that we used by an individual's total or a unit's total emissions, you could end up with a much smaller charge than that $40 felt per ton. And it also allows emissions to go up year after year while buildings are participating in this scheme without there being any penalty for the university's emissions as a whole increasing.
So we also had 5 other buildings in another treatment group, which we refer to as a performance target. If you want to take the one we just talked about, you could view it as a target if you wanted to, but that target is a moving average. It's the percent change in our building's emissions from the baseline, to the current year. And that is not easy to predict. Any building on campus would have an extremely difficult time calculating that average and sticking to it, whereas instead we could provide units with a more predictable target. In the case of the pilot, we provided 5 of these buildings with a 1% reduction target. If they reduced below that target, we would pay them $40 per ton for every ton that they reduced below, and if they came in over, they would receive a charge. And what's interesting is when you focus the design of this incentive internally, participants tend to prefer that. Of course they would. They're not being compared to their peers. But at the same time, this opens up the scheme design to gameability. You can easily imagine that units could start negotiating their performance targets. One might find that 1% isn't fair. And while we could customize these targets for each unit, you could imagine that would be extremely administratively burdensome. So while there are a lot of benefits to a design that use cap style mechanisms in the same way cap and trade works, there are also a lot of challenges.
So our third scheme design was an energy efficiency earmark. The idea behind this was that we could make the scheme somewhat revenue neutral on the unit level by sending back the percentage, the amount of money for the social cost of carbon, a certain percentage or all of it, back to the unit. So it was somewhat revenue neutral in that they would be getting their own money back, but it would be earmarked for energy efficiency investments. So there's, you can imagine some of the pros being that it guarantees investment on sustainability. It's very politically feasible because it's the most revenue neutral while still providing some incentive at the unit level. So you can imagine that participants in this scheme were quite, pleased to have been placed in this grouping. However, there, were some issues about potentially not having the investment amount being suboptimal, both potentially incentivizing overinvestment and as well as potentially incentivizing underinvestment by not encouraging units to spend more than what is earmarked and sent back to them in any given year. Not many participants capitalized on having a pot of money available to them to take investment over the course of the pilot. It was only a 6-month period, so perhaps there is a time frame issue with that, but we didn't see as much as we hoped that we would have during the 6 months.
We also wanted to test the power of information. On Yale's campus, we have quality energy data, which is all metered at the building level, but our different decision makers on campus are not necessarily receiving that information, and even if they are, which in many cases they are, it often requires a lot of careful searching, and there's not a lot of context to those numbers. And so our budget office, as well as other individuals at the university, thought, could we test this idea of an informational report, similar to a lot of work that you'll see out of the company O-Power, in addition to the incentive schemes that we just laid out for you. So this was that particular treatment group. 5 buildings received an informational bill only. It had their social cost of carbon, but there were no financial implications for this group. The other 3 groups also received this informational report in addition to the incentives. And what we learned from this group in particular was that information can be powerful. This group reduced by more than the treatment group by about a 3 percentage point margin. And we also found that there were some buildings that really took this report and ran with it. We had one building on campus which is home to our crew operations, and they were about 20% below baseline, simply because this information was motivating to them. But we are confident in that an incentive plus an informational report is the most motivating. And so moving forward, our next pilot will likely be information only as we work on integrating the carbon charge into the budget. And then moving forward, we'll ideally have more. Jen?
So we had several great examples of buildings being incentivizing and taking action because of the carbon charge. I'll highlight one really quickly. The School of Art took 2 actions that are really interesting. One is they had many lights that they noticed stayed on well into the night beyond the point where it was really necessary. And so they used, because of the carbon charge, they used that as incentive to really work with facilities to get those shut off at a reasonable hour. At the same time, they were contemplating having more open studio hours available over a winter break. Normally, they would just have approved those hours automatically. Instead, they actually had a meeting with the dean to make sure that the dean was aware this would increase their carbon charge, and to ensure that he felt like it was worth the additional cost. He did. It was his final year. He wanted the students to have action, so he ended up moving forward with those additional hours. But it was a great example of it affecting the decision making and the price of carbon playing a role in how people were making those decisions.
So, we want to just quickly show that this pilot, we did observe some reductions. Whether or not these reductions are a result of the carbon charge is not necessarily statistically significant, but as you can see, as I switch the slide, you'll notice that the actual emissions in the treatment groups actually fall below the baseline emissions, and so this is indicative of some learning, some change, and we're hoping to see moving forward that this separation will continue and we'll see more and more carbon emissions reduced on the campus. As far as how we might move forward, we are considering one scheme design. A key lesson that we learned and that many other companies have learned is that it's important to tie the carbon pricing mechanism into your company's existing priorities. And so what we'll be doing here at Yale is tying it into our different budget structures. We have self-support units, which are just like residential consumers. They pay all of their own utility costs. And we also have centrally supported units here on the campus, which experience the classic economic problem of the landlord-tenant split incentive. They have their utility costs paid for, and so we can treat these differently. And our hope is that we can, continue to test revenue neutrality with the self-supports and move more toward a model that operates on budgets and trying to provide small incentives to these buildings that normally have not bared the cost of their energy use.
So we, as was mentioned, we had this task force that was really theoretical. We had an initial academic year that we used to really take that theoretical plan for how to do this at the university and start to begin to understand how the implementation phase would go. And now moving forward, we're going to continue to refine that implementation, take our lessons learned and continue moving forward and figure out how to best create the carbon charge for Yale, because there's certainly no one-size-fits-all.
Before I let Jen wrap up and we also turn it over to Casey Pickett, who's going to be taking up the charge, we just want to surface these outstanding questions and also share a link to a white paper that's out summarizing a lot of what we've been talking about today. We were on a phone call the other day with TJ DiCaprio, who's doing a phenomenal job at Microsoft, and one of the most interesting ideas she put forth is that the minute they got this into their profit and loss statement, everything clicked. And while we haven't managed to do that here, and there are a lot of challenges associated with getting the carbon charge into a profit and loss statement, we're excited to see what potential this could have. We're also thinking about how this affects mixed-use buildings. We're thinking of incentives on the margin versus incentives in the aggregate. And we have these liquidity and capacity constraints where, are we investing enough, as you've heard? Are we doing as much as we possibly could? Are we teaching our students about this concept enough? And we think the carbon charge over time will be able to answer some of those questions and shed light on them for companies.
So just to wrap up, we felt like these were some really important, broad lessons that we could share with the business community. Probably most importantly, there's no one-size-fits-all for internal schemes. Every university company is very different, and so you can take some of the lessons learned from us and others, and those are all really important to create a framework. But then you really have to start to look internally and figure out with your systems how a carbon charge can be interwoven into that. Don't focus so much on price. When we were in India speaking with a lot of companies, people sometimes don't move forward because they just can't figure out a price, and we would encourage people to not let that stop them. The price can be changed. You can test out a price and decide it's either too high or too low, but don't let price just prevent you from moving forward at all. People and culture are really critical to success. An area we haven't explored, but we think is really interesting, is how a carbon charge, an internal carbon charge specifically, can be interwoven into human resources initiatives. And sharing best practices really helps. We've learned, Ryan and I, over the course of the past 2 years that we've been involved in this at Yale, have learned so much from other companies, nonprofits, individuals, and so we really encourage you to follow in their footsteps and hopefully in Yale's footsteps as well moving forward and continuing this collaborative environment around carbon pricing.
Great. Well, thank you so much, both of you. That's really rich. I know that this is really useful to have the presentation as well as the online resources and the white paper. I think you've gotten a lot of information there I'm sure people will be following up with. To start the Q&A, I wanted to come back to the right price trap. I think you're right, and I know you said it. I just want to talk a little bit more about that because we absolutely, that is the number one question we always get, is just tell me what price we should apply. They always ask us at the World Bank or at the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. You mentioned a social cost of carbon. I've heard companies say, well, we're not a social, why should we do that at that level, what the government thinks? What about climate risk? Can you quantify that? Are there others? I mean, I think that I've heard people looking at the regulated price levels and just saying, well, maybe perhaps let's use a surrogate. Talk a little bit more about the price you chose, because I think that's the first question that's going to stop up a lot of people doing this.
Yeah, I'll start quickly. I think that not only is the social cost, is price challenging, the social cost of carbon in and of itself is challenging and confusing because there's not even full consensus on what that price is. Right. So price is certainly a challenge. We chose the social cost of carbon tied to the federal government because we wanted to be confident in an academic setting that we had a reason, a justification that we could share with the community that we felt like the community would accept and really buy into. And I would say that the price is not something, despite the fact that people have asked us questions and pushed back on many aspects of the charge over the past year, the price was really not one that we got much pushback on. And so I think for us it was really important to just have a price we could be confident in. I think that we also were seeing that the RGGI cap and trade program that is part of New England that we're a participant in, that price was not enough. That price, doesn't get much over $5-10. I don't know what it is right now. I'm not up to date on it, but it just certainly wasn't high enough. So that gave us some framework to work within.
Yeah, our provost said that revenue neutrality is a confusing concept to explain. I think Jen's right on in the sense that the social damages caused by carbon dioxide emissions really resonated here on our campus. We have a lot of scientists, a lot of students, a lot of faculty and staff interested in these ideas. And so it's surprising to me as Jen says that because I didn't give it much thought. We didn't get a lot of pushback on the price. And I think if you can stand firmly in the price that you pick and align it with the mechanism that you have, you should be able to move forward with it. The one other point I would make is, with these carbon prices and with social cost of carbon and a lot of financial decisions you'll make, a lot of it can hinge on the discount rate that you pick. And when we talk about the social cost of carbon, are we talking about a 1% discount rate, a 5% discount rate, 8%? That becomes sort of a moral question. And I think that is one that we have to implore when we start thinking about the social cost of carbon.
Right. Thank you. I think we have time for just another short question, and I want to take one of the questions we got. I think it's a creative, already getting people's wheels turning here. So the question was, what role, if any, does Yale see in third-party financiers coming in to finance improvements that might happen on campus, and then could they benefit from the carbon charge? Did you guys discuss that at all?
Yeah,
That's interesting. Go ahead.
I'll jump in. We obviously do a lot of great energy efficiency work on the campus. Just in 2015, Yale earned one of the largest rebates, if not the largest rebate, for energy efficiency work from our local utility. And we look forward to continuing in those efforts moving forward. We haven't talked about interfacing with the utility specifically around the idea of the carbon charge. Obviously, there are potential cost savings for all of us internally. They may not move beyond our boundary here, but as the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative continues to strengthen here in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic states, there may be opportunity to dovetail the internal system we have here with the external ones that we see.
Yeah, it brings up an interesting challenge that we talked a lot about. You know, when you have a free market and a carbon charge applied to it, you spur innovation, you spur new firms to fill, you know, those gaps. You have new energy efficiency consultants coming in. And how does Yale, you know, interact with those that do currently exist? And then how does our carbon charge help to promote the growth of those types of actors, and how do we provide the appropriate services to our units if we are not, you know, we're not internally a free market. And so, you know, we have a facilities department and an energy management team in place, funded centrally by the university. How does the carbon charge, you know, interact with them as a team, and how are we making sure that as we increase incentive for services, we actually can meet that? And so it's a really interesting thing to think about how moving forward we will, you know, incentivize those types of actions, you know, financial investment here internally, but also potentially bring in outsiders.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you so much, both of you. I think, as I said, really rich discussion. I take away the main point, I think, is really to just get started, learn by doing. You can tweak as it goes along, but I think you're learning a lot as you're going, and it's really valuable to share these lessons with everybody.
Yeah, and as Tim said, define your objectives and focus on those.
Right. Great.
And they're only your own.
Well, thanks. So now we're going to just close the webinar with just a final wrap-up and next steps. We'll bring back Tim Pavlis as well as Casey Pickett, who is the new director of the Carbon Charge Program. Be curious to hear from them based on what you've just heard. What are the next steps for rolling out the Carbon Charge Program?
Great, thanks, Tom. And I just wanted to say in this setting a big thank you to Jen and Ryan for their leadership. They were both members of the task force that was conceptualizing this, and then, you know, really spearheaded a great effort on our campus in this last year. So thank you both. I'm lucky to have Casey Pickett, a double Yale graduate at Forestry and School of Management, who is picking up the torch to carry this charge forward. And so I wanted to let Casey just give you a short overview of what we're doing next, and also to encourage, you know, all of you who I know are going to be on this journey, you know, with us to recognize Casey and to engage him in your efforts. So, Casey.
Thanks very much, Tim. Thanks, Tom. So just to speak briefly about the road ahead so far, for the next 6 months, we will be providing all buildings on campus with an informational report covering their energy use and CO2 emissions. And then, so that will get people used to getting this kind of feedback and engaging with energy and CO2 emissions data. And then starting in July for the fiscal year 2018, we'll be actually beginning to make the money real, incorporating the carbon charge into organizational budgets. And we'll continue the flow of informational reports as well. We expect that putting the carbon charge into organizational budgets will begin to have the long-term impact on major decisions that Provost Pollack described as the highest priority. That's the plan. And so on behalf of Yale, I'd like to thank all of you for engaging with us in this work to incorporate the pricing of carbon into organizational financial decisions. And a special thank you to the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition for all of your great work on this. We look forward to working with many of you on this webinar in the future.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Casey and Tim. I think just to wrap up then, valuable information is available online. This webinar has been recorded. You can share it and download it and watch it again or share it with colleagues. Also, I wanted to remind people, someone was mentioning Microsoft. They will be our next webinar. The date is going to be set very soon. We will be having it sometime in December before the end of the calendar year. And finally, we would like to invite other companies who may be watching and also implementing their own carbon pricing program. We'd love to hear from you. I think we're creating a community here of knowledge and learning and sharing, and I think the more we can hear from different sectors, different parts of the world, again, experimentation is welcome. informed. I think it helps the whole journey together. We're all learning here, and there are a lot of questions that are very common, so hopefully this webinar series has helped to answer some of those questions and become a resource for all of you. So thanks again to Yale for hosting today. It's been a pleasure to be with all of you, learn a lot, and look forward to hearing about the good news in the coming years. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.